The auctioneer's gavel hung frozen in midair as two women in silk and pearls lunged across the platform, fingers clawing at each other's faces, while their husbands stood paralyzed in the crowd. Blood from a torn earlobe spattered onto the auction block, where a man stood 7 feet tall, his wrists chained but his eyes tracking every movement with the stillness of someone who had learned to read violence the way other men read ledgers. The date was March 17, 1858, and in the town square of Natchez, Mississippi, beneath magnolias heavy with spring bloom, the wives of two of the wealthiest cotton planters in Adams County were destroying each other over the right to purchase him. What the crowd didn't know, what the husbands would never discover until it was far too late, was that neither woman wanted him for the fields. Before we continue with what happened next, if you believe these stories of resistance, dignity, and the hidden strategies of survival need to be told, subscribe to this channel right now. Comment Natchez below if you're watching from anywhere in Mississippi or the Deep South. Share this with someone who needs to understand that history is never as simple as the textbooks pretend. Our people's stories deserve to be remembered in full. Now let's go back to how this impossible moment came to be. 6 months earlier in September 1857, a man named Samuel, no last name recorded in any ledger because the enslaved were denied that dignity, arrived at the Forks of the Road slave market in Natchez after a forced march of 400 miles from a failing plantation in northern Alabama. The market sat at the intersection of the old Natchez Trace and Liberty Road, a location chosen with deliberate irony by men who trafficked in human beings while speaking endlessly of American freedom. Samuel was 28 years old, stood 84 inches tall, weighed 260 pounds of muscle, built from years of blacksmith work, and possessed a face that showed no emotion whatsoever, a survival skill he had perfected by age 12 when he watched his mother sold away to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The trader who purchased him in Alabama paid $900, a price depressed by the panic of 1857 that had crashed cotton prices and tightened credit across the South. That same trader, a man named Virgil Hastings who operated out of a brick warehouse near the Natchez riverfront, knew he could triple his investment in Mississippi, where the richest planters in America competed for prime field hands and skilled laborers. Hastings specialized in what he called premium stock, men and women whose physical capabilities or specialized skills commanded extraordinary prices. His ledgers, preserved in the Adams County archives, show he sold 143 people in 1857 alone, with an average profit margin of 212%. But Samuel was different from anyone Hastings had ever handled. The blacksmith skills were valuable, certainly. A man who could forge tools, shoe horses, and repair cotton gins saved a plantation thousands of dollars annually in equipment costs. The size was remarkable, the kind of physical presence that intimidated other enslaved workers and reduced the need for overseers in the fields. But what made Samuel truly extraordinary, what Hastings recognized within days of acquiring him, was an intelligence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He spoke with perfect grammar when addressed directly, could calculate measurements and weights in his head faster than most white men with schooling, and demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of metallurgy that suggested someone had violated Mississippi's strict laws against teaching the enslaved to read. The state's statute, enacted in 1823 and strengthened in 1846, imposed fines of $500 and up to 6 months' imprisonment for anyone caught teaching a slave to read or write. The law existed because literate enslaved people could forge travel passes, read abolitionist materials, communicate across plantations, and organize resistance. Samuel never admitted to literacy, Doing so would have made him unsellable, a dangerous commodity that planters would reject out of fear. But Hastings noticed how Samuel's eyes tracked the words on shipping manifests, how he positioned himself to see documents on desks, how he absorbed information from conversations he appeared not to be listening to. The trader made a calculated decision. He would market Samuel's physical and technical skills while concealing the intellectual capabilities that made him genuinely dangerous. Hastings placed Samuel in the warehouse's skilled labor section, a separate area from the field hands, and began circulating word among Natchez' elite that he had acquired an exceptional blacksmith. The city's planter class operated within a rigid social hierarchy based on cotton production, land holdings, and slave ownership. At the top sat men like Richard Ashford and Thomas Waverly, owners of plantations exceeding 5,000 acres each, with enslaved populations numbering in the hundreds. Ashford's Magnolia Vale plantation produced 1,800 bales of cotton annually, generating revenue of $90,000 in good years. Waverly's Riverside estate matched those numbers and added a profitable sideline in breeding and selling enslaved workers to newer plantations in Texas and Arkansas. The wives of these men, Catherine Ashford and Mary Ann Waverly, occupied a peculiar position in Southern society. They were expected to embody genteel femininity, manage household slaves with velvet-gloved authority, organize social events that reinforced class hierarchies, and never acknowledged the sexual violence that permeated plantation life. Both women were in their early 30s, educated at female academies in Charleston and New Orleans, fluent in French, accomplished at piano, and trapped in marriages that combined immense wealth with profound loneliness. Their husbands spent weeks away from home, managing cotton operations, conducting business in New Orleans and Memphis, and maintaining relationships with enslaved women that produced mixed-race children everyone pretended not to notice. Catherine Ashford, the daughter of a Virginia tobacco planter who had lost everything in the Panic of 1837, had married Richard for security and discovered that wealth could not fill the emptiness of a loveless union. She managed 43 household slaves with efficiency that other planters' wives envied, ran an estate that hosted governors and senators, and spent her evenings reading novels that depicted romances she would never experience. Her husband visited her bedroom perhaps once a month, performed his marital duty with mechanical efficiency, and returned to his own quarters without conversation. She was 29 years old and felt as though her life had already ended. Mary Ann Waverly came from New Orleans Creole aristocracy, brought to the marriage a dowry of 22 slaves and $30,000 in railroad bonds, and discovered within a year that her husband preferred the company of a light-skinned enslaved woman named Celia, who lived in a cottage behind the main house. Thomas Waverly made no effort to hide the arrangement. Southern white men considered such relationships their prerogative, a right of ownership that their wives were expected to ignore. Mary Ann responded by withdrawing into the management of her household, cultivating a reputation for exacting standards and cold efficiency that made her slaves fear her more than they feared the overseer's whip. Both women heard about Samuel through the intricate network of information exchange that connected plantation households. Enslaved domestic workers carried news between estates, discussing market arrivals, prices, and notable individuals with a sophistication that their owners never suspected. Catherine's lady's maid, a woman named Dinah who had been with her since childhood, mentioned the giant blacksmith during a morning dressing session in late February 1858. Mary Ann learned of him from her housekeeper, an older woman named Patience, who managed Riverside's domestic operations with quiet authority. Both enslaved women described Samuel in terms that went beyond his physical capabilities. They spoke of dignity, of intelligence, of a presence that suggested he was more than what the auction block reduced him to. Catherine Ashford made the first visit to Hastings' warehouse on March 3, 1858, accompanied by her husband's plantation manager and 2 male slaves for protection. The trader's records show she spent 45 minutes examining Samuel, asking questions about his blacksmith training, his experience with different metals, his ability to read technical diagrams. Hastings, sensing an opportunity, quoted a price of $2,500, nearly triple what he had paid, but justified by Samuel's skills and size. Catherine didn't negotiate. She told Hastings she would discuss the purchase with her husband and return within the week. That same afternoon, Mary Ann Waverly arrived at the warehouse with her own entourage. The timing was not coincidental. Patients had informed her of Catherine's visit within 2 hours, using the communication network that connected enslaved communities across Natchez. Mary Ann spent even longer with Samuel, asking similar questions but also inquiring about his health, his temperament, whether he had ever been violent or attempted escape. Hastings, recognizing he had created a competitive situation, raised his price to $3,000. Mary Ann's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her composure and departed without committing. What happened over the next 2 weeks has been reconstructed from fragmentary evidence: diary entries, letters between the women and their relatives, testimony from enslaved witnesses interviewed decades later by WPA researchers, and the detailed records Hastings kept of every interaction with potential buyers. The picture that emerges is of 2 women who saw in Samuel something their husbands could never understand. Not just a valuable laborer, but a human being whose intelligence and dignity offered a kind of companionship their marriages denied them. Catherine Ashford began visiting the warehouse every 3 days, always with different excuses. She needed to verify his blacksmith credentials. She wanted to see him work metal to assess his skill level. She had questions about his medical history. Hastings noticed that her questions became increasingly personal. Did Samuel have a wife? Had he been separated from family? Could he read truly? The trader, who had spent 20 years studying human behavior to maximize profits, recognized something he had seen before in lonely plantation wives, a fascination that went beyond economic calculation. He raised his price to $3,500. Mary Ann Waverly matched Catherine's visits, arriving on alternate days with her own questions and observations. She brought a French novel and left it on a table near where Samuel worked, watching to see if his eyes tracked the text. She asked Hastings if Samuel could be taught to drive a carriage, to manage other slaves, to handle responsibilities beyond the forge. Her questions revealed a woman imagining how this man might fit into her daily life, what roles he might occupy beyond those defined by plantation labor. Hastings, playing both women against each other with the amoral skill of an expert manipulator, told Mary Ann that Catherine had offered $4,000. It was a lie, but it worked. The enslaved community in Natchez watched this developing situation with a mixture of hope and dread. Samuel had become a figure of intense interest among them. His size and bearing made him impossible to ignore, but his intelligence and composure suggested possibilities that most enslaved people had learned to suppress. Dinah and Patience, the 2 women who served Catherine and Mary Ann, began meeting secretly in the market square on Sundays, sharing information and trying to understand what their mistresses intended. Both had seen plantation wives develop obsessive interests in particular slaves before, relationships that ranged from maternal fixation to something far more complicated and dangerous. Samuel himself remained almost completely silent through all of this. Hastings' records note that he answered questions with minimal words, never volunteered information, and showed no reaction to the escalating attention from 2 of the wealthiest women in Mississippi. But the trader noticed something the women didn't. Samuel was listening to everything, absorbing every detail of their conversations, their questions, their unspoken desires. When Catherine asked if he could read, Samuel said no, but Hastings saw his eyes flick to the warehouse ledger on the desk, saw him track the handwritten entries with perfect comprehension. When Marianne asked about his family, Samuel said they were gone, but his jaw tightened in a way that suggested the loss was recent and devastating. By mid-March, both women had convinced their husbands to attend the public auction Hastings had scheduled for March 17th. Richard Ashford agreed because his plantation's blacksmith had recently died of pneumonia, and replacing skilled labor made economic sense. Thomas Waverley consented because his wife rarely asked him for anything, and purchasing an expensive slave would demonstrate his wealth to Natchez society. Neither man had any idea that their wives had been visiting the warehouse repeatedly, that they had developed a competitive obsession with acquiring this particular man, or that the auction would become a public spectacle that would be discussed in Mississippi drawing rooms for years afterward. The morning of March 17th dawned clear and warm, with temperatures reaching 78 degrees by 10 o'clock when the auction began. Hastings had scheduled Samuel for late morning after the field hands and domestic workers, building anticipation among the crowd of 200 planters, traders, and curious townspeople who filled the square. The auctioneer, a man named Pemberton who had conducted slave sales for 30 years, understood the psychology of his work. He started with Samuel's physical attributes, describing his height and strength in terms usually reserved for prize livestock, then moved to his blacksmith skills, emphasizing the economic value of a man who could save a plantation thousands in equipment costs annually. The bidding opened at $2,000, with Richard Ashford making the first offer. Thomas Waverley immediately countered with $2,500. The crowd murmured. These were extraordinary prices for a single slave, even one with valuable skills. Pemberton, sensing the potential for a record sale, slowed his rhythm, letting tension build between each bid. Ashford went to $3,000. Waverley responded with $3,500. The murmuring grew louder. These men were bidding against each other, something that violated the unspoken protocols of planter society, where such competitions were handled privately to avoid public displays that might damage business relationships. Then Catherine Ashford did something that shattered every rule of Southern feminine propriety. She stepped forward from where she had been standing behind her husband and said, in a voice that carried across the square, $4,000. The crowd went silent. Women did not bid at slave auctions. Women did not involve themselves in financial transactions in public spaces. Women certainly did not contradict or override their husbands in front of the entire community. Richard Ashford's face went crimson, but before he could speak, Marianne Waverley pushed past her own husband and declared $4,500. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses later gave conflicting accounts. Catherine Ashford moved toward the auction block, whether to get closer to Samuel or to physically prevent Marianne from claiming him, no one could say for certain. Marianne intercepted her halfway up the platform steps. Words were exchanged. Some witnesses reported Catherine called Marianne a Creole whore. Others said Marianne accused Catherine of being a barren failure. Then Catherine's hand shot out and grabbed Marianne's pearl necklace, snapping the string and sending beads scattering across the wooden platform. Marianne responded by seizing Catherine's elaborate upswept hair and yanking hard enough to pull her off balance. The two women crashed together in a tangle of silk, crinolines, and fury. Catherine's fingernails raked across Marianne's cheek, drawing blood. Marianne drove her knee into Catherine's ribs with force that suggested she had abandoned every pretense of gentility. They rolled across the platform, past the stunned auctioneer, past the equally shocked Samuel, who stood chained and watching with those unreadable eyes. Catherine tore Marianne's earlobe, the blood spattering onto the auction block. Marianne grabbed a fistful of Catherine's hair and slammed her head against the wooden planks, once, twice, 3 times before their husbands finally recovered from their paralysis and rushed forward to separate them. It took 4 men to pull the women apart, their husbands plus 2 overseers who had been maintaining order in the crowd. Catherine's dress was torn at the shoulder, her carefully arranged hair hanging in disheveled strands, her face scratched and already beginning to bruise. Marianne's cheek bled from 4 parallel gouges, her ear dripped blood onto her ruined silk bodice, and her eyes blazed with an intensity that made even her husband step back. The crowd stood in absolute silence, witnessing something that would become legend. 2 of the most refined ladies in Mississippi society had just engaged in a physical brawl over the right to purchase a slave. Pemberton, the auctioneer, found his voice and attempted to restore order. He declared Marianne Waverly the winner at $4,500, the highest price ever paid for a single slave in Natchez history. Thomas Waverly, his face pale with humiliation and rage, paid Hastings in cash and banknotes, while his wife stood bleeding and disheveled, staring at Samuel with an expression that combined triumph and something far more complex. Catherine Ashford was led away by her husband, weeping not with shame, but with frustrated fury, her hands still clenched into fists. Samuel was unchained from the auction block and rechained for transport to Riverside Plantation. As he was led past Marianne Waverly, he looked directly at her for the first time, a violation of the unwritten rules that required enslaved people to keep their eyes downcast in the presence of whites. Their gazes met for perhaps 3 seconds. Witnesses later disagreed about what they saw in that moment. Some said Samuel's expression showed contempt. Others claimed they saw recognition, as if he understood exactly what Marianne wanted from him and had already begun calculating how to use that knowledge. The scandal consumed Natchez society for weeks. Both families retreated to their plantations, refusing social invitations and public appearances. Letters between plantation wives across Mississippi and Louisiana discussed the incident with a mixture of horror and fascination. How could 2 respectable women have descended to such behavior? What could possibly have motivated them to fight like common tavern girls over a slave? The speculation ranged from suggestions that both women had lost their minds to darker theories about unnatural desires that respectable people didn't discuss in polite company. But the speculation missed the truth, which was both simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. Catherine and Marianne had not fought over sexual desire, though that element existed in the complicated tangle of loneliness, power, and forbidden possibility that plantation life created. They had fought over the chance to possess something their marriages denied them, a companion who was intelligent enough to understand them, powerless enough to be safe, and present enough to fill the vast emptiness of their daily lives. They had fought over the possibility of being seen, truly seen, by someone who might recognize their humanity, even as the law denied his own. Samuel arrived at Riverside Plantation on March 18, 1858, and was immediately installed in the blacksmith shop, a substantial brick building located 200 yards from the main house. Marianne Waverly visited him there on his second day, bringing a list of equipment repairs she claimed needed immediate attention. She stayed for an hour, watching him work, asking questions about his process, commenting on the precision of his movements. Thomas Waverly, consumed with managing the plantation's spring planting and still furious about the public humiliation of the auction, paid no attention to his wife's sudden interest in blacksmith operations. Over the following weeks, Mary Ann's visits to the forge became daily occurrences. She brought books ostensibly to read while waiting for repairs to be completed, but she left them on the workbench where Samuel could see them. She asked his opinion on matters that plantation wives never discussed with slaves: the quality of iron being shipped from Pittsburgh, the efficiency of different forge designs, the properties of various metals. Samuel responded with careful precision, offering information that demonstrated his knowledge while never crossing the line into familiarity that could get him killed. The enslaved community at Riverside watched this developing relationship with deep anxiety. Patience, the housekeeper, tried to warn Mary Ann that her behavior was creating dangerous talk among the other slaves and would eventually reach Thomas Waverley's ears. Mary Ann dismissed the concerns with aristocratic hauteur, insisting she was merely ensuring the plantation's equipment was properly maintained. But Patience knew better. She had seen the way Mary Ann looked at Samuel, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, the way she found excuses to touch his arm when examining his work. What no one except Samuel understood was that Mary Ann Waverley was not simply lonely or infatuated. She was conducting an experiment in power and possibility, testing the boundaries of what she could control in a life where she controlled almost nothing. Her husband made every significant decision about the plantation. Her father-in-law's will dictated how her dowry was invested. Mississippi law gave her no right to own property independently, and social convention required her to pretend she didn't notice her husband's relationship with Celia. Samuel represented something different, a man whose intelligence matched or exceeded her own, whose presence she had fought for and won, whose labor and time she could command absolutely. Samuel, for his part, was playing a far more dangerous game. He had recognized within days of arriving at Riverside that Mary Ann's interest in him created both opportunity and mortal risk. The opportunity lay in the access her visits gave him to books, to information about plantation operations, to knowledge about the Waverley family's business dealings and social connections. The risk was that Thomas Waverley or any of the overseers might interpret Mary Ann's attention as evidence of sexual impropriety, which would result in Samuel's immediate execution regardless of the truth. He began to construct a careful strategy, one that required him to walk an impossibly narrow line between encouraging Mary Ann's interest, enough to maintain his privileged position, while never giving anyone grounds to accuse him of inappropriate behavior. He responded to her questions with deference and intelligence, demonstrating his value as a skilled craftsman and knowledgeable consultant, while maintaining absolute physical distance. He never initiated conversation, never looked at her directly unless she asked him a question, and never touched her or allowed her to touch him in ways that could be misinterpreted. But he also began to read the books she left for him, absorbing information at night in the slave quarters by the light of the forge's banked coals. He studied technical manuals on metallurgy and engineering, novels that depicted worlds beyond Mississippi, and, most dangerously, newspapers that Mary Ann had finished with and left in the forge. Through those newspapers, Samuel learned about the growing sectional crisis between North and South, about abolitionist activity in northern states, about the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, and about the increasing likelihood of war. By June 1858, 3 months after the auction, Samuel had accumulated more knowledge about the world beyond Riverside Plantation than most enslaved people acquired in a lifetime. He knew that Canada offered freedom to any enslaved person who could reach its borders, that certain routes through Tennessee and Kentucky were less heavily patrolled than others, and that Quaker communities in Ohio provided assistance to runaways. He also knew that attempting escape from Mississippi was nearly suicidal. The state maintained slave patrols on every major road, offered rewards of $500 for captured runaways, and imposed brutal punishments designed to deter others from trying. But Samuel had something most enslaved people didn't have: detailed knowledge of the Waverly family's business operations, gained from months of listening to Mary Ann discuss plantation affairs. He knew that Thomas Waverly traveled to Memphis every 6 weeks to sell cotton and purchase supplies, that he took the steamboat from Natchez and was gone for a minimum of 10 days. He knew that the plantation's overseer, a man named Garrett, drank heavily and often passed out in his cabin by 9 o'clock. He knew that Mary Ann controlled the household slaves' movements and could provide cover for unusual activity without her husband's knowledge. Most importantly, Samuel had begun to understand that Mary Ann Waverly's obsession with him had evolved into something that might be leveraged. She had started bringing him gifts: a better hammer, higher quality iron stock, a new leather apron, items that improved his working conditions but also demonstrated her desire to please him. She had begun asking his advice on matters beyond blacksmith work, seeking his opinion on household management decisions, and even on personal matters like which dress to wear to social events. She was, in ways she probably didn't fully recognize, treating him less like property and more like a confidant. Samuel decided to take a calculated risk. On a humid evening in late July, when Mary Ann made her daily visit to the forge, he asked her a question, the first time he had ever initiated conversation. He asked if she had read a particular novel by Charles Dickens that he had seen in the pile of books she brought. The question was carefully chosen. It demonstrated his literacy without explicitly admitting to it. It engaged her on intellectual ground, and it created an opening for a different kind of relationship. Mary Ann's reaction confirmed what Samuel had suspected. Her face lit up with surprise and pleasure, and she spent the next hour discussing Dickens with an enthusiasm she had never shown for blacksmith repairs. She asked how he had learned to read, and Samuel told her a partial truth, that his previous owner's daughter had taught him letters before her father discovered it and sold Samuel south. Mary Ann responded by bringing him more books, more newspapers, more materials that fed his hunger for knowledge and, unknowingly, his plans for escape. By September 1858, 6 months after the auction, Samuel had assembled the components of an escape plan that was audacious in its scope and dependent on factors he could not fully control. He would wait for Thomas Waverly's next trip to Memphis, which was scheduled for mid-October. He would use Mary Ann's trust to gain access to the plantation stables, claiming he needed to shoe horses that had been neglected by the regular farrier. He would take one of the fastest horses along with supplies he had been slowly accumulating: dried food, a knife, a compass he had stolen from the plantation office, and forged travel papers he had created using his blacksmith skills to make a convincing seal. The route he planned would take him north through the Homachito National Forest, avoiding main roads and traveling only at night. He would cross into Tennessee near Shiloh, then move northeast toward Kentucky and the Ohio River. If he could reach the river, he knew of crossing points where sympathetic whites sometimes helped runaways. From Ohio, he would head to Canada, where British law prohibited the return of escaped slaves. The journey would cover more than 800 miles through some of the most heavily patrolled territory in the South. The odds of success were perhaps 1 in 20, but the alternative was spending the rest of his life as Mary Ann Waverly's exotic pet, his intelligence and dignity slowly corroding under the weight of her possessive attention. What Samuel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Catherine Ashford had never stopped thinking about him. The humiliation of losing the auction had festered in her mind for 6 months, transforming from wounded pride into obsessive determination. She had begun making inquiries through the enslaved network, paying her maid Dinah to gather information about Samuel's life at Riverside. She learned about Mary Ann's daily visits to the forge, about the books and gifts, about the unusual relationship developing between mistress and slave. And Catherine began to formulate a plan of her own. In early October, Catherine convinced her husband Richard to host a dinner party for the Waverleys and several other prominent planter families. It would be a gesture of reconciliation, she told him, a way to put the embarrassing auction incident behind them and restore normal social relations. Richard, who had been excluded from several business opportunities because other planters found the auction scandal distasteful, agreed immediately. Invitations were sent, and Thomas Waverley, eager to rehabilitate his family's reputation, accepted on behalf of himself and Mary Ann. The dinner was scheduled for October 12, 1858, 3 days before Thomas Waverley's planned trip to Memphis. Catherine spent weeks preparing not just the menu and decorations, but a more complex scheme that would require perfect timing and the cooperation of enslaved people who had their own reasons for wanting to disrupt the Waverley household. She approached Dinah with a proposition. If Dinah could get a message to Patience at Riverside, and if Patience could arrange for Samuel to be brought to Magnolia Vale on the night of the dinner party, ostensibly to repair some urgent equipment failure, Catherine would pay both women $50 in gold and guarantee they would never be sold away from their families. $50 was more money than most enslaved people saw in a lifetime. It was also evidence of how completely Catherine's obsession had consumed her rational judgment. Dinah and Patience both understood that what Catherine was proposing was insane. Bringing Samuel to Magnolia Vale while the Waverleys were there would create a situation that could only end in disaster. But $50 could buy freedom, or at least the materials and bribes necessary to attempt escape. Both women agreed. The message reached Patience on October 8th. She approached Mary Ann with a fabricated story. Magnolia Vale's blacksmith had been injured in an accident, and they desperately needed someone to repair critical cotton gin equipment before the harvest. Could they possibly borrow Samuel for one evening? Mary Ann, who prided herself on being a generous neighbor despite her private rivalry with Catherine, agreed without suspicion. She told Patience to arrange for Samuel to be transported to Magnolia Vale on the evening of October 12th to complete the repairs and to return before dawn. Samuel learned of the plan on October 10th, 2 days before it was to occur. Patience told him the truth, that Catherine Ashford had arranged this, that the equipment failure was fictional, and that he was being brought to Magnolia Vale for reasons that had nothing to do with blacksmith work. She also told him that she and Dinah were being paid $50, and that if he wanted to use the chaos of that evening to disappear, they would not stop him or raise an alarm until morning. It was the closest thing to an offer of help that enslaved people could safely give each other. Samuel understood immediately that he was being handed an opportunity that might never come again. He would be away from Riverside with legitimate authorization. He would have access to Magnolia Vale's horses and supplies, and the confusion of the dinner party would delay any pursuit. He told Patience he would repair whatever equipment Catherine wanted fixed, and then he would return to Riverside as instructed. Patience looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Both of them understood what he was really saying. The evening of October 12th arrived with temperatures dropping into the 50s and a thin crescent moon that would provide minimal light. Perfect conditions for someone who needed darkness. Samuel was transported to Magnolia Vale in a wagon driven by one of Riverside's field hands, arriving at 7 o'clock just as the dinner party guests were gathering in the main house. He was directed to the equipment shed behind the slave quarters, where Catherine Ashford appeared within minutes, alone. What passed between them in that conversation has never been recorded, but its outcome became clear in the hours that followed. Catherine offered Samuel his freedom, not through legal manumission, which would have required her husband's consent and state approval, but through active assistance in escape. She would provide him with a horse, money, detailed maps showing safe routes north, and letters of introduction to anti-slavery contacts in Tennessee and Kentucky. In exchange, she asked for nothing except that he remember she had helped him, and that if he ever had the chance to tell his story, he would include her role in his liberation. Samuel accepted, though he must have understood the complexity of Catherine's motives. She was not acting from pure altruism. She was striking at Mary Ann Waverly in the most devastating way possible, taking from her rival the prize they had fought over. But she was also offering him genuine freedom, and Samuel was pragmatic enough to accept help regardless of the giver's motivations. Catherine provided everything she had promised: a fast horse, $80 in gold and silver, maps marked with Underground Railroad contacts, and letters that identified him as a free blacksmith traveling north to find work. At 9:30 that evening, while the dinner party continued in the main house with Mary Ann and Thomas Waverly seated at Catherine Ashford's table, Samuel rode out of Magnolia Vale heading north. He carried the forged travel papers he had created months earlier, the supplies he had accumulated, and Catherine's maps and letters. He also carried something else, a note that Catherine had written to Mary Ann, to be delivered the following morning, that read simply, "I won." Samuel traveled through the night, covering 40 miles before dawn. He avoided main roads, used the stars and compass to navigate, and stopped only to rest the horse and eat from his supplies. By the time Riverside Plantation discovered his absence the next morning, he was deep in the Homachito forest, following a route that would take him away from the most heavily patrolled areas. By the time Mary Ann Waverly received Catherine's note and understood what had happened, Samuel was crossing into Tennessee. The pursuit that followed was extensive but ultimately futile. Thomas Waverly, humiliated for a second time by his wife's obsession with Samuel, posted a reward of $1,000 for his capture and return. Slave patrols searched the roads and forests of southwestern Mississippi for 2 weeks, but Samuel had too much of a head start, too much knowledge from the maps and letters Catherine had provided, and too much motivation to ever allow himself to be recaptured. He reached the Ohio River on November 3, 1858, 22 days after leaving Magnolia Vale. He crossed into Ohio with the help of a Quaker farmer whose name appeared on Catherine's list of contacts. He continued north through Ohio and Michigan, traveling mostly at night, working odd blacksmith jobs for money, and moving steadily toward Canada. On December 1, 1858, he crossed the border at Detroit and became legally free under British law. The aftermath in Natchez was devastating for everyone involved. Mary Ann Waverly fell into a depression so severe that her family sent her to relatives in New Orleans for treatment. She never fully recovered her social position. The story of how she had been outwitted by Catherine Ashford, how her obsession with a slave had led to his escape, circulated through Mississippi society for years. Thomas Waverly, facing ridicule from other planters, became increasingly brutal in his management of Riverside's enslaved population, as if he could restore his masculine authority through violence. The plantation's productivity declined, and he sold it in 1862 as the Civil War made cotton operations impossible. Catherine Ashford achieved a Pyrrhic victory. She had struck at her rival and helped a man gain freedom, but she had also exposed herself to suspicion. Rumors circulated that she had aided Samuel's escape, though no one could prove it. Her husband, sensing the truth, became cold and distant, and their already loveless marriage deteriorated into bitter coexistence. When the Civil War began in 1861, Richard Ashford joined the Confederate Army and was killed at Shiloh in 1862, the same area Samuel had passed through on his journey north. Catherine lived until 1889, never remarrying, managing Magnolia Vale alone through Reconstruction and its aftermath. Samuel's life in Canada has been partially documented through letters he wrote to abolitionist newspapers and through interviews conducted in the 1880s. He established a blacksmith shop in Chatham, Ontario, a town that became home to thousands of escaped slaves. He married a woman named Sarah who had escaped from Virginia, and they had 4 children. He became active in the abolitionist movement, speaking at gatherings about his experiences and advocating for the complete destruction of slavery. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Samuel did not return to the United States. He had built a life in Canada and saw no reason to go back to a country that had denied his humanity for 28 years. In 1887, a researcher from Oberlin College interviewed Samuel, who was then 58 years old, as part of a project documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people. The interview, preserved in the college's archives, provides Samuel's own account of the auction, the relationship with Mary Ann Waverly, and his escape. When asked about the 2 women who had fought over him, Samuel said something that revealed both his intelligence and his understanding of the complex motivations that had shaped his life. "They didn't fight over me. They fought over what they thought I represented, a way to feel powerful in lives where they had no power. Mrs. Waverly wanted to own something that proved her superiority. Mrs. Ashford wanted to take that away from her. I was never a person to them, not really. I was a symbol. The difference was that Mrs. Ashford was willing to destroy the symbol to win the fight, and in destroying it, she accidentally set me free." The story of the 1858 Natchez slave auction, where 2 plantation wives fought over Samuel, became a legend in Mississippi, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions portrayed it as a romantic tragedy, with both women secretly in love with the handsome slave. Others framed it as evidence of the moral corruption that slavery created, showing how the institution degraded everyone it touched. The truth, as Samuel's testimony suggests, was more complex, a collision of loneliness, power, obsession, and the fundamental inhumanity of a system that reduced people to property. The auction block where the fight occurred stood in Natchez Town Square until 1866, when it was torn down during Reconstruction. The Forks of the Road slave market, where Samuel first arrived in Mississippi, operated until 1863, when Union forces occupied Natchez. The site is now marked with a historical plaque that mentions the market's existence, but provides little detail about the thousands of people who were bought and sold there. Riverside and Magnolia Vale plantations still exist as private properties, their histories sanitized in tourist brochures that emphasize antebellum architecture while minimizing the brutality that funded it. In the archives of Adams County, Mississippi, researchers can find Virgil Hastings's ledger recording the sale of Samuel to Mary Ann Waverly for $4,500, the highest price ever paid for a single slave in Natchez history. The ledger lists Samuel only by his first name, his age, his height, and his skills. There is no mention of his intelligence, his dignity, or his humanity. There is no record of what he thought or felt as he stood on that auction block, watching 2 women destroy each other over the right to own him. The historical record, like the slave system itself, was designed to erase the interior lives of the enslaved, to reduce them to economic data. But Samuel survived to tell his own story, to claim his own narrative, and to insist on his humanity in a world that had tried to deny it. His testimony, preserved in archives and abolitionist newspapers, stands as evidence that the enslaved were never the passive victims that plantation mythology portrayed. They were strategists, observers, and actors who navigated impossible circumstances, with intelligence and courage. Samuel used the obsessions of two lonely women to gain access to knowledge and opportunity, then used that knowledge to engineer his own freedom. He turned the dehumanizing system of slavery against itself, exploiting its contradictions and the weaknesses of those who believed they controlled him. The question that haunts this story is what happened to Dinah and Patience, the two enslaved women who facilitated Samuel's escape. Historical records provide no clear answer. Both women disappear from plantation ledgers after 1858, which could mean they were sold, that they died, or that they successfully used the $50 Catherine paid them to purchase their own freedom or escape. The silence of the archives on their fates is a reminder of how much of slavery's history has been lost, how many stories of resistance and survival were never recorded or were deliberately destroyed. What we do know is that the network of communication and mutual aid that connected enslaved people across plantations was real and sophisticated. Dinah and Patience's willingness to help Samuel despite the enormous risks reflected a broader pattern of solidarity that sustained resistance throughout the slavery era. Enslaved people shared information, provided cover for each other's activities, and created spaces of autonomy within a system designed to eliminate all freedom. The fact that Samuel's escape succeeded depended not just on Catherine Ashford's assistance, but on the cooperation of multiple enslaved people who chose to help him even though they could not help themselves. The story also illuminates the complex position of white women in the slave South. Catherine and Mary Ann were both victims and perpetrators, trapped in loveless marriages and denied legal rights, but also wielding enormous power over the enslaved people they owned. Their fight over Samuel revealed the emptiness at the heart of their privileged lives, the ways that wealth and social position could not compensate for the fundamental human needs for companionship, respect, and purpose. But their suffering, real as it was, existed on an entirely different moral plane from the suffering of the people they enslaved. They had choices, however, constrained by gender and social convention. The enslaved had none. Modern historians studying this incident have debated its significance. Some see it as an aberration, an unusual case that reveals little about the broader patterns of slavery. Others argue that it exposes fundamental truths about the institution, how it corrupted all human relationships, how it created pathologies in both enslaved and enslaver, and how the rigid hierarchies of race, gender, and class intersected in ways that produced both oppression and unexpected opportunities for resistance. The fact that two wealthy white women would physically fight over a slave in public view suggests how completely the logic of ownership had penetrated Southern society, how thoroughly people had been reduced to commodities whose possession conferred status and power. But the story's ultimate significance lies in Samuel's agency and survival. He was not a passive object of white women's desires or rivalries. He was an intelligent strategist who recognized opportunity, calculated risks, and executed a plan that required extraordinary courage and skill. He survived a 400-mile forced march from Alabama to Mississippi, endured months of being treated as an exotic possession, navigated the dangerous attention of Mary Ann Waverly, recognized and accepted Catherine Ashford's offer of help, and successfully completed an 800-mile journey to freedom through territory where capture meant torture and death. His story is one of thousands of escape narratives from the slavery era, each one a testament to the human drive for freedom and dignity. But Samuel's story is unusual in being relatively well documented, with multiple sources, auction records, plantation ledgers, newspaper accounts, and his own testimony that allow us to reconstruct events with some confidence. Most enslaved people who attempted escape left no record beyond a brief notice in a newspaper offering a reward for their capture. Most who succeeded in reaching freedom never told their stories, fearing that doing so might endanger family members still enslaved or reveal routes and methods that others might use. The fact that Samuel was willing to be interviewed in 1887 to have his story recorded and published suggests he understood the importance of historical memory. By then, slavery had been abolished for 22 years, but the struggle over how it would be remembered had just begun. Former Confederates were already constructing the mythology of the lost cause, portraying slavery as a benevolent institution and the enslaved as content with their condition. Samuel's testimony, like that of thousands of other formerly enslaved people interviewed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, stood as a direct refutation of those lies. When we remember the 1858 Natchez slave auction, we should remember it not as a bizarre spectacle of white women fighting, but as a moment when the contradictions of slavery became visible in ways that couldn't be ignored or explained away. We should remember it as evidence of the complex humanity of all the people involved, the loneliness and obsession of Catherine and Marianne, the calculated assistance of Dinah and Patience, and above all, the intelligence, courage, and determination of Samuel, who refused to accept the dehumanization that slavery imposed. We should also remember that Samuel's freedom came at enormous cost and risk, and that for every person who successfully escaped, thousands more remained enslaved until the Civil War and emancipation. His story is inspiring, but it should not be used to suggest that slavery could be overcome through individual effort, or that the enslaved were somehow responsible for their own liberation. Freedom came through collective resistance, through the political and military struggle of the Civil War, and through the sacrifices of hundreds of thousands of people who fought and died to destroy the institution. The historical markers and tourist sites that commemorate plantation life in Mississippi and across the South rarely tell these stories. They focus on architecture, on the lives of wealthy white families, on the economic systems that produced cotton and wealth. The enslaved people who made that wealth possible, who built the houses and worked the fields and endured the violence, are often reduced to background figures or mentioned only in passing. The resistance, the escapes, the networks of solidarity and mutual aid, these are stories that challenge the comfortable narratives of Southern heritage and force us to confront the moral horror at the foundation of that society. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that historical memory should include the voices and experiences of the enslaved, then share this account with others who need to understand the full truth of American history. Comment below with your thoughts about Samuel's strategy and escape, about the roles of Catherine, Marianne, Dinah, and Patience, about what this story reveals about slavery and resistance. Subscribe to ensure you see future stories that recover these hidden histories and center the humanity of people who were systematically dehumanized. Where are you watching from? Comment your location below so we can see how far these stories of resistance and survival are reaching. Let's build a community committed to remembering and honoring the courage of people like Samuel, who refused to accept the chains that others tried to impose, who risked everything for freedom, and who survived to tell their stories in their own words. Their legacy demands that we remember, that we learn, and that we never allow history to be sanitized or forgotten.